Hey, it's Hermodice Curriculata again, and today I want to talk about my favorite topic when it comes to polychaete worms, symbiosis. Symbiosis is the term used to describe a relationship between organisms of different species. The reason I love this topic is because there are so many different types of relationships that polychaetes form with their environment, ranging from animals, plants, to even microorganisms. Due to this, they have been a massive stepping stone in symbiosis research in general, and another reason being that I find it quite adorable. So let's get straight into it. Symbiosis with other animals takes many forms. For example, this is a polynoid worm which attaches to a starfish and the gills of certain mollusks. Since it isn't a very good swimmer, it is, however, a very good host, because it heavily relies on the worm. This goes both ways. You see, they have a mutual relationship. When a predator threatens the host, the worm bites it to drive it away. When separated from the host, it uses chemical cues to find its way back to them. This is a silent worm, which lives inside the tissue of a sponge. This is an example of endosymbiosis, since the worm lives within the tissues of the organism. It sucks the nutrients from the tissue of the sponge, while relying on it for protection. And like the polynoid, sometimes even manages to protect the sponge from predators. Some worms also have tubes, which are used by organisms like crustaceans as a living space for shelter, such as this crab living in the tube of this parchment worm. Parasitism is also common within polychaetes. This is a mesostomid, which is commonly found hosting on the exterior of crinoids, a type of echinoderm. They use their hooked setae to stay glued to their host, or some may even stimulate a growth called a gall on the host, which is used to wrap around the worm and keep it intact to the echinoderm. Like any parasite, the mesostomid eats its food and even its poop. A lot of polychaete worms also fall victims to parasites themselves, such as this blue tube worm, which has gregarine parasites living in its intestines. For those interested, and even for those not interested, gregarine parasites are just parasitic algae that live inside invertebrates. Polychaetes also form symbiotic relationships with the plants surrounding them. This shouldn't be too surprising, as a lot of animals rely on plants for food, since they are primary consumers, and they form habitats for many in the terrestrial world. Similar concepts is applied to polychaete worms. This, for example, is a neomycid, which wraps itself around branches of corals, causing the coral to grow extraskeletal materials. This commensal relationship provides protection for the worm against predators using the extraskeletal material, and it strengthens the corals as well. The worm also relies on food from the polyps while they clear the sediments. And of course, it should go without saying that like most organisms, polychaetes rely on algae and other plants in the water for oxygen to respire, while simultaneously providing it with carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. Now, we get on to the even more interesting part of this topic: symbiosis with microorganisms. This is such a fascinating and important branch of polychaete symbiosis, and I remember the first time I learnt about this and was blown away. So, to start it off, this is a Pompeii worm. It is found in hydrothermal vents of the Pacific Ocean. It is one of the most heat-tolerant animals in the world, being able to survive in temperatures over some 100 degrees Celsius. Because of this, they're named after the city of Pompeii in Rome, which was destroyed due to a volcanic eruption in 79 AD. To add to this, they have bacteria living on their hairy backs, which feed on the mucus secreted from the worm's glands. And, in return, the colonies of bacteria provide the worm with insulation. It is speculated that the bacteria contain special proteins, which give them the ability to survive in a wide range of temperatures and therefore passing this ability onto the worm itself. So yeah, it's pretty amazing. However, it doesn't end here. The most famous and groundbreaking example of symbiosis between microorganisms and polychaetes lies in Chemosymbiosis. This is a form of symbiosis where bacteria provides energy and nutrients for a multicellular organism. These are giant tube worms. They also live in hydrothermal vents in the deep sea, where there's a complete absence of sunlight, so there's no scope of photosynthesis taking place here whatsoever. Being able to survive in these conditions was thought to be impossible by people for many years. I say to those people,
well, first of all, through God, all things are possible, so jot that down.
So now the question is, how do they even live? For almost every ecosystem to survive, the sun is
the source of all our power.
Well, there's a nice backstory to explain this. Think 70s. Shortly after the discovery of hydrothermal vents in 1977, these tube worms were presented at a lecture in Harvard University, led by the curator of worms, Meredith Jones. He explained that the worm had no mouth, no gut. So the question arose of, how do they feed? He went on to describing a type of tissue in the gut called a trophosome. He specified that it contained some crystallized elemental sulfur. This caught the attention of a first-year graduate called Colleen Cavanaugh, who suggested that the worms had sulfur-oxidizing bacteria to feed the worm. Now, it's important to remember that Jones was probably quite senior in his position, as well as experience. So, hearing a first-year graduate student in her 20s who wasn't a microbiologist or a biochemist speaking so confidently about such an uncertain field such as this one may not have been his cup of tea. However, Cavanaugh later proved her point by observing the trophosome further under a microscope and seeing these sulfur-oxidizing bacteria herself. They were shaped like round grapes. This was because they had lost their cell walls while living in the tissues of this host, which modified the shape of the bacteria. With this, she was able to prove that the bacteria inside these worms were using hydrogen sulfide to generate energy for the metabolism of the worm. How does this work? To explain how energy is provided in the absence of sunlight, we need to understand how it is generated with sunlight. Of course, with the example of plants. Here, we enter the terrains of biochemistry. We know that photosynthesis requires energy from a light source, the most common one being the sun. Here, a photon of light hits the plant's photosynthetic pigment called chlorophyll. This raises the energy level of an electron, and this electron travels through what is called the electron transport chain. This is where they lose energy at carriers called electron carriers, and this energy is ultimately used to produce a molecule called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. This is the main energy currency of the cell, and it splits into its constituent, ADP, also known as adenosine diphosphate, and a phosphate group. This releases energy for metabolic reactions in the plants, such as making starch and other carbohydrates for the plants to survive. This is only a summary of a much more complicated process, but it seems pretty straightforward so far, right? Now, how is this process carried out without the photon of light provided by sunlight? The answer is hydrogen sulfide. In the hydrothermal vents, there are lots of black smokers which have metals of sulfides produced as smoke, and they're reduced to hydrogen sulfide. And this hydrogen sulfide is used for its electrons in the electron transport chain. The oxygen they get from the water is used as the electron acceptor, and just like in the chloroplast of a plant, the electron produces ATP, which is used to convert carbon dioxide into organic substrates such as glucose. The crystallized elemental sulfur found in the trophosome earlier was only the byproduct of this reaction. And as we all know, glucose and oxygen is equal to water and carbon dioxide. But how do the bacteria get inside the worms? The answer is simple. Through the worm's cell walls during early development. And the hydrogen sulfide and oxygen? Through the bright red ciliated tentacles at the top of their heads called plumes. These plumes get their bright red color from the high concentrations of hemoglobin present on them, helping them to function as basically the lungs of the worms, taking in hydrogen sulfide, oxygen, and carbon dioxide. So yeah, that is the summary of symbiosis in Polychaete communities. I hope you liked this video as much as I enjoyed making it for you. Let me know in the comments what you think of my current style of illustrating videos. Should I keep using images, or would you want me to go back to doing mainly drawings and stuff? Just let me know what you prefer, because either way, feedback is always appreciated. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more Polychaete stuff, and I will see you next time.